Chapter 1. Invaders. It was 1066, and Edward, King of England, was dead. He had no children. The most important people in the country met to choose a new king. They chose Harold. Harold wasn't a blood relative of King Edward, but he was the Queen's brother. He was a popular man for the job, but other powerful men wanted to be king too. One of them was the King of Norway, Harald Hardrada, and a few months after King Edward's death his army invaded the north of England. King Harold of England went north, defeated the invaders, and killed King Harold of Norway. But 3 days later, there was more bad news. William of Normandy in the north of France was on the south coast of England with an army. Before King Edward died, he chose me as the next king, he said. Perhaps this was true. Edward's mother was a Norman, and Edward lived in Normandy as a child. He preferred Normans to the people of England. So Harold raced south with his army. William was waiting for him at Hastings. At the end of the battle, Harold was dead and William of Normandy was William the Conqueror. King of England, Roman Britain. The Normans weren't the first people who invaded Britain. In 55 BC, the great Roman Julius Caesar brought an army across the sea from France. For 400 years, England was part of the Roman Empire. When the Romans first arrived, there were many different groups of people. Each group had its own king. They didn't think of themselves as British, but the Romans called the people from all these groups Britons. Boudica. The Romans tried many times to conquer the areas of Britain that we now call Wales and Scotland, but they never kept control there. In the rest of Britain, the local people were much easier to control, but Boudica was different. Her husband was a local king in the east of England. When he died in 60 the Romans tried to take all his money. Roman soldiers attacked Boudica and her daughters. Boudica was angry. Soon she had an army of Britons behind her. They attacked Colchester, London and St Albans, the 3 most important cities in Britain at that time, and destroyed them completely. But in the end, the Romans defeated her. There is a story that her body lies under London's most famous railway station, King's Cross. In many places around the country, you can still see the straight roads, strong walls, and fine houses that the Romans built. In the new Roman towns, Britons started to live like Romans. They wore Roman clothes and went to the theater and the baths. Most townspeople could speak Latin. Many could read and write it too. In the later years of Roman rule, they became Christian, the Angles and Saxons. But in 409, the Roman army left Britain to fight in other parts of the empire. Soon after this, invaders from present-day Germany and Denmark, the Angles and Saxons, came to Britain. The Angle and Saxon armies destroyed everything in their path, and the Roman way of life disappeared from Britain. Many Britons moved west to escape the invaders. By the 7th century, groups of Britons were in control of present-day Scotland, Wales, and Cornwall, but Angles and Saxons ruled the rest of Britain. People started to call this area Angleland. Later, its name became England. The Vikings. Then, at the end of the 8th century, new invaders started attacking the coasts of Britain of Vikings from Scandinavia. At first, they came to steal gold and silver from monasteries. Then some made their homes in Britain, and from the 860s they controlled a large area of northern and eastern England. The Saxon kings fought against them. Alfred the Great defeated the Vikings and sent them away from Britain. But they returned, and in the early 11th century there was a Viking king of England, King Knut. The Normans. The Normans came next. Their conquest was probably the most important in British history because it was the last. Since 1066 and the Battle of Hastings, many people have moved to Britain from other countries. For example, a lot of French and Dutch Protestants arrived in the 17th century to escape problems with the Catholics in their homelands. And in the 20th century, large numbers of people came from India, the Caribbean, and other places that were in the British Empire. But no foreign army has conquered Britain since the Normans. William the Conqueror had to fight other Saxon armies in England after Harold was defeated. But then he was able to build a new, Norman England. By 1068, he owned all the land. He asked his Norman friends to look after it for him. They made money from the farmland and paid some of it to the king. They also used the money to pay for Norman soldiers. Each Norman lord built a home with strong, high walls and lived there with his private army. The Saxons owned nothing. They belonged to the Norman lords. For more than 200 years, the language of government and literature was the Normans' language, French. The Saxons continued to speak their own language, Anglo-Saxon, with some Scandinavian words. The Saxons' language finally grew into modern English, but as a result of the Norman invasion, half the words in today's English language come from French. Chapter 2. The United Kingdom. England is a country, but it isn't a state. It is part of a state called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. This name is less than 100 years old, but English rule in other parts of the United Kingdom started soon after the time of William the Conqueror. Wales. When England was safely under their control, the Normans started the conquest of Wales. The conquest was completed by William the Conqueror's son. There were a few years of independence in the 12th and 13th centuries, but since 1280 the rulers of England have also ruled in Wales. The Welsh language is still spoken by 500,000 people. Scotland. Scotland stayed independent much longer than Wales until the end of the 13th century, when it was conquered by the English king, Edward I. But 30 years later, it became independent again. England and Scotland finally came together in 1603. Queen Elizabeth I of England died without children, and her nearest relative was James, King of Scotland. During the next century, the two countries had the same kings and queens, but different parliaments and laws. Twice in that time, the English Parliament chose a new king for both countries. The Scots were very angry. Some wanted war with their more powerful neighbor, but others saw a better future. England was growing rich from its empire abroad. Scotland was failing to build its own empire. So Scotland should join England, and as one country, they could enjoy the empire together. The English liked this idea, but the Scots weren't so sure. Finally, In 1707, the Scottish Parliament voted to join England. Many Scottish politicians were paid to vote this way. Scotland lost its own parliament, and the Scottish politicians moved south to London. England, Scotland, and Wales were now one state, Great Britain. When Scotland joined England, the two countries' differences didn't just disappear. In 1715, and again in 1745, people from the Highlands in the northwest of Scotland and from other areas fought to have a new king. They were defeated both times. In 1745, the English destroyed complete villages. Many people were killed, and the lucky ones were sent abroad. The Scots never fought the English again. By the end of the 18th century, they were joining the British Army in large numbers and playing an important part in the government of the British Empire. Ireland. Ireland's story was very different. Ireland was first conquered by an army from Britain in 1171. The Irish finally won independence for most of their island in 1922. In all that time, British rule brought Ireland very little money and a lot of trouble. The Norman invasion of Ireland in 1171 was the idea of an Irish king, Dermot of Leinster. When he stole another king's wife, he lost power over his lands. He asked the English king, Henry II, for help. Henry sent an army, and the island of Ireland has never been completely independent since then. Henry II. Henry II became King of England because of his Norman mother. He was the first king from the Plantagenet family that ruled England after the Normans. He also ruled the French lands of his wife and his father. At its greatest, his empire reached from Ireland to the Pyrenees Mountains in the southwest of France. The kings of England continued to rule lands in France until 1557. Norman lords ruled the area around Dublin, and most of the time they were independent of the government in England. Irish kings continued to control the rest of the country. Little changed until the 16th century, when most people in Britain became Protestant. Most Irish people stayed Catholic. The Catholics tried to push the Protestants out of Ireland, but they failed. In 1607, the last Catholic lords left the country, and, for the first time, all of Ireland was controlled by England. The Protestant rulers of England wanted to make Ireland less Catholic. So they decided to send large numbers of Scottish Protestants there. Most of these Scots made their home in the north of Ireland, and their families still live there today. The Irish Catholics didn't like the Protestants in the north or the English government. In every British war of the 17th century, the Catholics fought for the side that lost. As a punishment, Catholics in the early 18th century couldn't own land, or even a good horse. There was an Irish parliament, but Catholics couldn't vote or be politicians. Irish Catholics became very poor, and the rich Protestant landowners weren't interested in their problems. Some of the laws against Catholics were changed after a few years, but too little was done too late. In 1798, the Irish fought unsuccessfully for independence from England. After this, the English decided to end the Irish Parliament. Irish politicians, like the Scots before them, moved to London. There, They joined the parliament of a state that was now called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Most Catholics in Ireland ate little except the potatoes that they grew on their very small farms. In the 1840s, potatoes failed to grow in Europe. In most countries, this was not a serious problem because there was other food. But in Ireland, the result was terrible. People started to die. The British government did very little to help. The Church of England offered free food, but only to people who became Protestant. Of a population of 8.5 million, about 1 million died and another million went abroad, most of them to the U.S. The Catholic dream of an independent Ireland continued. After battles in Parliament and in the streets of Irish cities, independence finally came in 1922. But the Protestants in the north refused to be part of a Catholic Irish state. So Ireland was cut in two. Northern Ireland continued to be part of the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland. About 35% of the people in Northern Ireland were Catholic. They wanted to be part of the independent state of Ireland. The Protestants were afraid of the Catholics, so they controlled the votes for politicians unfairly. They also kept the best jobs and houses for themselves. In the 1960s, Catholic demonstrations were stopped violently. So the British government sent their army to protect the Catholics. But Catholics didn't want the British army in their country. A Catholic group, the IRA, started to fight for independence from Britain in the north. When the first IRA fighter shot a British soldier, many Catholics were pleased. The IRA killed British soldiers and Protestant policemen and politicians. Later, they killed anyone who was Protestant or British. Catholic violence was answered with more violence by the British Army and the Protestant Irish. Terrible things were done by all sides. But perhaps the worst violence has now passed. In the last few years, IRA activity has stopped. Many Catholic and Protestant politicians and the British and Irish governments are trying to build a Northern Ireland which is free of violence and fair for all. National parliaments. The Welsh and Scots haven't fought battles against the English for many centuries, but the idea of independence from England never really died. England is the biggest of the 4 countries in the United Kingdom, so it has the largest number of politicians in the Parliament in London. Many people in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland felt that the London Parliament didn't do enough for them. In the 1990s, the Scots, Welsh, and Northern Irish were given their own parliaments. They still have politicians in London, but they have others in their own capitals, Edinburgh, Cardiff, and Belfast. These national parliaments make some decisions, for example about schools and hospitals, but tax, the army, and other important matters are still controlled from London. Chapter 3. God. End. Government. Henry VIII was King of England in the early 16th century. He was handsome and clever. He loved sport, music, and dance. No king was ever more popular with his people, but he was worried. He didn't have a son to follow him as king. In the half-century before Henry's rule, England suffered terribly as two families fought for control of the country. Now these wars were finished and Henry's family, the Tudors, were in control. But the wars could easily start again after his death. For Henry, a son was very important, and more important even than his people's religion. Catholic Britain. From the 7th century, almost everyone in Britain was a Roman Catholic. By the time of Henry VIII, the Catholic Church was very powerful. In those days, only a few people reached the age of 50. Life after death was very important to them, and for this they needed the church. Even the poorest farmers gave the church 10% of the food that they produced. They also worked on church land without payment. Rich families gave large amounts of money. Everyone believed that they were buying a better life after death. The church became very rich, much richer than the King of England. Henry VIII. 2 women, 2 churches. Catherine of Aragon was a Spanish princess. She was married to Henry's older brother. He died young, and Henry, as the future king, decided to marry Catherine. She was useful to England because Spain was one of the most powerful countries in Europe. A Christian couldn't usually marry his brother's wife, but the head of the Catholic Church, the Pope, gave special permission. Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon had only one child, a daughter, Mary. When no son came, Henry looked for a reason. He decided that his marriage to his brother's wife was wrong. As a punishment, he and Catherine had no sons. Henry was always interested in other women, but now he fell completely in love with a young Englishwoman, Anne Boleyn. She was much younger than Catherine. She was clever and funny, and maybe she could give Henry a son. Henry sent his assistant, Thomas Wolsey, to Rome to ask the Pope for an end to his marriage with Catherine. But the Pope was the prisoner of one of Catherine's relatives. He couldn't agree to Henry's request. Wolsey went back to England and told his king the bad news. Henry was very angry. He put Wolsey in prison. Then he made a decision that changed Britain forever. The Pope was head of the Catholic Church, and he was being difficult. So in 1534, Henry closed the Catholic Church and started a new one, the Church of England, with a new head, the king. A few politicians and priests spoke in disagreement against this, so Henry cut off their heads. Henry was the writer of a book which attacked the religious ideas of the Protestants. But now his new church followed these Protestant ideas. The Bible was read in English in church, not in Latin, and there were no pictures in church of anyone except Jesus. For people in the 16th century, these changes were very serious. But to Henry, they didn't matter, because he was only interested in one thing. His new church gave him permission to end his marriage with Catherine. Then he married Anne Boleyn. Henry soon realized that his power as head of the church was useful in other ways. He needed money, and the church had lots of it. Monasteries own large areas of land, and gold and silver too. So he decided to close them. Henry took everything. Many beautiful buildings were destroyed, and 11,000 religious men and women suddenly lost their homes. You can still see the broken walls of old monasteries in many parts of Britain today. Henry's other wives. Sadly for Henry, his new church didn't solve his marriage problems. When Anne Boleyn gave Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, but no son, he cut off her head. He finally had a son with his third wife, Jane Seymour. but she died after the birth of the baby. His fourth wife was Anne of Cleves, a German princess who he chose from a picture. In real life, she was very ugly, and he ended their marriage after 6 months. He didn't make the same mistake again. Catherine Howard was a beautiful English girl of 16 when she married Henry, a fat 49-year-old. But Henry learned that she had a lover. He cut off her head. His sixth wife, Catherine Parr, was luckier than the rest. Henry died before her. Edward VI. After Henry VIII's death, his 9-year-old son became king. Edward VI was an unhealthy but very intelligent boy, and he had strong ideas about religion. He started to make England even more Protestant than under his father. But he only lived to the age of 15. There was nobody who could become the next king. So Edward's older sister Mary became queen. Mary won. Mary, Catherine of Aragon's Catholic daughter, throughout all the Protestant changes that were introduced by her father and brother. Most people in England were happy about this. They didn't like Protestant ideas very much. But then Mary killed lots of Protestants. In 3 years, 280 men and women were burned in front of crowds of people. Mary became very unpopular. She was 38 and unmarried when she became queen. She hated the idea of Anne Boleyn's Protestant daughter, Elizabeth, as the next queen, so she really wanted a child. She married King Philip of Spain. Twice she thought she was having his baby. But she had a stomach problem and it killed her. The return of the Catholic Church in England died with her. Elizabeth won. When Mary's sister Elizabeth became queen, she tried to find a middle way for religion. She wanted a Church of England that Protestants and Catholics could accept. But this was impossible. First, the Puritans didn't like it. The Puritans were Protestants who wanted simple churches and simple clothes for their priests. To them, the Church of England wasn't different enough from the Catholic Church, and they didn't want the Queen as head of the Church. Elizabeth thought that their ideas were dangerous. Many Puritans were put in prison or killed. Second, the Catholics didn't like it. The Pope told the people of the Catholic Church to end Elizabeth's rule.
Henry VIII's marriage to her mother, Anne Boleyn, was wrong, he said.
He secretly sent European priests to England to start a Catholic war against the Queen. So Elizabeth made Catholicism against the law. People had to pay lots of money if they didn't go to a Protestant church on Sunday. Lots of Catholics were put in prison, and a few were killed. Catholic priests continued to travel around the country secretly, but it was very dangerous. There are still many big 16th century houses in England with priest holes as secret places for Catholic priests to hide. Mary, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth's closest relative was her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. In 1567, Mary made the people of Scotland very angry when she married her husband's murderer. She had to escape to England, leaving her baby son James as King of Scotland. Elizabeth wanted to make her welcome. But to Catholics, Mary was the true Queen of England because Henry VIII's second marriage wasn't real. So Elizabeth had even more problems with her Catholic enemies. Mary lived as a prisoner in England for 19 years. Finally, Elizabeth's spies proved that Mary was making plans against Elizabeth. Elizabeth sadly ordered her death. William Shakespeare. Elizabeth's rule was a time of danger for some, but many other people enjoyed life. Plays became very popular, and England's first real theater was built. The greatest writer for the theater was William Shakespeare. His father was an ordinary trader, and he only went to school in Stratford-upon-Avon until the age of 14. Later, he worked in London as a writer and an actor. Some of his 37 plays were watched by the Queen at her palace, and they are still enjoyed around the world today. The Spanish attack England. The next danger for Protestant England came from the most powerful country in Europe as Spain. In 1588, the Spanish king, Mary I's husband Philip, sent 27,000 men in 130 ships to the English coast. England had little hope of defeating them. Philip's ships tried to join a Spanish army from the Netherlands. But luckily for England, the wind and an attack by English boats made this impossible. The Spanish ships were defeated and decided to return home. But they hit a terrible storm, and half the Spanish ships were destroyed. Spain and the Catholics lost some of their power in Europe, and England continued to be a Protestant country. When Elizabeth died in 1603, after 45 years as queen, most of her people were strongly Protestant. Religion. After Elizabeth, later in the 17th century, Britain had a Catholic king, James II. But by then it was impossible to bring the people of Britain back to the Catholic Church. After only 3 years, he had to leave Britain and a new, Protestant king was chosen. Today, Christianity doesn't have the same importance in Britain that it had in earlier centuries. The numbers of Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs are growing, and a large part of the population doesn't believe in God. But there are still many more people in the Church of England than in the Catholic Church. Continued. Next part. Coming soon. Thanks for watching.